Le Duc d'Albe is a really important and exciting story because he was a real man, and this opera takes place at the same time as Verdi's Don Carlos, written so many years later, and Philip II, who plays such a role in that opera, sent the Duke of Alba to look after the Netherlands. He was a famous, stern, austere ruler. He inspired hatred and fear. And the opera hinges on the way the Belgians try to get their own back at their conquerors, how they try to plan to murder the Duc d'Albe, and the plot is foiled. And that takes us to the end of the second act. And the interest in this subject is the combination of the politics and the private life. It was one of the great types of story in the 19th century opera, and it was something that Verdi himself found so fascinating. The public ruler, stern, austere, strict, has a big problem. He's lost his son. His son has no father. And the point of the opera is bringing these two together and them realizing that they are on opposite sides of the field. Because this young man, Henri of Bruges, is in fact the son of the Duke of Alba. And this tension that arises from this fact is, of course, a wonderful subject for music. He got sidetracked as he was writing it. He thought it would be his great opportunity to write an opera for the Paris Opera House. To write an opera for Paris is the equivalent of writing a musical for New York. It was something that every operatic composer dreamt of doing. And this work would have been his debut in the Paris Opera. Not that some of his other operas hadn't been performed in other theatres, but this was the top job. But it didn't work. It somehow wasn't accepted. There was a sort of antagonism to the opera as he was writing it, and he was asked if he could provide something else. And Les Martyrs, that Opera Rara has recently recorded, was around at the same time, but that was a French version of an Italian existing tragedy. Le Duc d'Albe was his first really French opera. And that's important because what the Parisians expected in terms of style, writing for the voice, writing for the orchestra, the way the opera unfolds, was very different from what they would have expected at La Scala in Milan. So he had a job on to find a new style, new harmonies, risky harmonies, writing big-scale scenes, not little arias, always being interrupted by applause. They didn't like the Italian bravura, the vocal showing off. They preferred the text to be set almost syllabically so that they could concentrate on the quality of the drama, the quality of the poetry in the libretto. And this was something that Donizetti was brilliant at adjusting to. He completed these two acts almost entirely. And there are little bits that we've needed just to recompose. The third and fourth acts don't exist enough to really make a job of it. And he wrote some of the vocal lines, he wrote some of the bass lines, so we know what the harmony would have been, little indications perhaps of orchestration, but not enough to make the basis of another edition. But I thought it was important for Opera Rara to bring this mature, late Donizetti to an audience that knows so much of his writing. And the writing for the orchestra, the writing for the voices is extremely exciting. And he has, by this time in his career, such skill in developing the story and in how to pace the acts. I think Martin's done a marvelous job. And the way it comes in and out of what Donizetti has already written, you're right, it's extremely skillful and clever. And I hope that it doesn't jar at all. The completion that was done at the 1880s, a full 40 years later, by an Italian composer, Salvi, never attempted to try and find Donizetti's style. That wasn't an issue in those days. He merely clothed the torso, but he did it in music that belonged to a different era. And nowadays, that jars, and you can hear, oh gosh, there's a bit of Salvi. And what we've tried to do is to make it flow in the language of Donizetti of that time. Obviously, one of the things that's so attractive to me about this particular project is to do it with my own orchestra, the Halle. So here we are in Manchester, in our marvellous recording and rehearsal venue that we've only had for a couple of years. And there's a marvellous atmosphere here. It's just the right sort of acoustic in which this opera should be performed. It has resonance, but it's not resonant. It's dry and clear, and I can hear all the words. The orchestra has done very little of this sort of music. The bel canto period is actually challenging for orchestras, and the different composers in it are very different one from another. And we did a comedy a couple of years ago of Donizetti's, a late French comedy, Rita. And I thought they played it wonderfully with the right sort of lightness and skill. And it seemed to me it would be a good idea just sometimes to keep this type of music in their experience. Because unless you're in an opera house orchestra, it's very hard to become familiar with this style. And there's so much great music written at this period. And I'm thinking from 1820 to 1850, that sort of time. And I think it's a challenge because it's different. We're not quite sure where the music's going. We're finding it, we're creating it. And of course, that's one of the definitions of opera rara, that the opera is rare. And so nobody can have prior experience of it. And that gives a sense of creativity and experimentation, and particularly with a piece that didn't get performed in Donizetti's time, we're trying to second guess what he might have done had he rehearsed it with the singers and the orchestra. Make little emendations, balance it differently, phrase it, above all, phrase it. One has to remember, when you do these recordings of very dramatic works, that the effects will only become obvious through the ears. There's no visual world to it at all. And I have to think very carefully, are the voices, are the instruments telling the story in the way they play and sing? And that takes time, because nobody has spent any time yet on this piece to bring it to life. There will be one or two performances of the completion by Salvi, but that's not really satisfactory to me. So what we're trying to do here is something really fresh, and the work has never had a proper studio recording. That is to say, time to develop what everybody does, and so that the best takes will make a really superlative recording. In asking a symphony orchestra to play music that was written perhaps 10 years after Beethoven's death, is asking them to find a sound and a sound world that is very different from what they normally play. This is classical music. It's not romantic music per se. Schumann is romantic music, for instance. But Donizetti was taught by a teacher from Bavaria, so he had northern European influences when he was a young man, and his whole experience of developing as a composer led him further north than any other Italian composer of that period. So that means his music is full of lovely touches, lovely bits of scoring that Verdi, in the beginning of his career, wouldn't have thought of particularly. And Bellini, Donizetti's contemporary, certainly avoided. And I find all that lovely and irresistible. But the challenge for the orchestra is to find the world and relate it to something that they know. So we try and make a sound that isn't too ripe and rich and thick, but is skillful and mercurial and able to change color and tempo and atmosphere as the libretto demands. And they're wonderful. They're so quick and they're so alive to what the music seems to demand. But it mustn't be an opera from 1890, it has to be an opera from 1825, something coming out of the classical period with romantic additions. Yes, these great French operas, of course, demand a knowledge of the French language that is very, very challenging. It's a tricky language to sing in. It's a tricky language to speak, of course, because the sounds that form the basis of French conversation are made in such different parts of the face. And it's so hard to sing when you've been taught to sing in a certain way with the openness that Italian, and I must say Russian, has as a language, a singing language. And French is a great language, but it's just different. And it's hard to persuade everybody to find all those special on, sounds that come in the nose. And I think this is a very good libretto. It's very dramatic and colourful. It has a lot of variety of pace. And it's hard for us all, chorus, soloists alike, to master it.